Welcome back. I'm glad to have you back again. I hope that the midterm went okay for you, that you got it properly submitted, and I'm glad that you have been able to make your way through half of the course and half of the authors that we're presenting in this Myths of Rome course. So I'm very glad to have you here, and let's now start buckling down for the second part of the course. Now, in a different video, we're going to be talking about the special assignments that you'll need to do related to Ovid. So make sure that you do review those videos carefully, because the assignments are not entirely the same as the ones that you completed in the first half of the course, especially the character presentations that you're going to do related to characters in Ovid's Metamorphoses, the main work that you're going to be studying here in the course. So make sure that you review those when you come to them, and make sure that you carefully read Metamorphoses through, because it's an important work in itself, but also you need to review it carefully enough to be able to complete those assignments. All right, without further ado, we're going to begin this second half of the course by introducing our next author, Ovid. You actually did encounter Ovid previously when you read his work called Heroides, those 6 letters written by women to their neglectful, abandoning, high-minded, and chauvinistic husbands or boyfriends or men, whoever they may be. You can therefore from that get a sense of the way that Ovid presents men in society, which is definitely not very well. He is not very complimentary of heroes. In a way, he's kind of an anti-heroic poet, in contrast to Virgil, who seems to walk the party line, so to speak, when he writes Aeneid to celebrate the Roman Empire. Ovid didn't cooperate nearly as well as Virgil did, and it ended up costing him, because in fact Ovid ended up going into, there it is, exile. More on that coming up in a little bit. First of all, let us please have you pause your video, and please now go into Sakai under Resources and open up handout number 4, the one on Ovid. Please pause your video and go to Resources under Sakai and open handout number 4. Okay, do you have that video? Excuse me, not the video. Do you have that handout? And the video too, of course. Excellent. Let's now begin talking about Ovid. He was born 43 BC, which means that he was born the year after the assassination of Julius Caesar, and 11 years before the effective termination of the fall of the Republic. I should say 12 years. In 31 BC, the Battle of Actium, when, as we talked about in a previous video, Octavian defeated Mark Antony and would eventually accede to the position of princeps, which really transferred itself into emperor, and which eventually brought Octavian the title of Augustus. So Ovid is about a generation after Virgil in that sense, even though he and Virgil did in fact have some years in which they were contemporary. We do not in fact know for certain how much contact there was between Ovid and Virgil, except that, as we're going to talk about further in the bio, Ovid was in fact one of the poets who received state sponsorship much the same way that Virgil did. In fact, Ovid's whole life and political career mirrors Virgil's very closely until we get to that unfortunate matter of the exile that we'll be talking about in a little bit. So, as such, Ovid did write poetry that was, as with Virgil, exploring new ways of writing poetry in Latin after the model of the Hellenistic poets' works in the effort of trying to explore genres. Ovid did that really effectively, and in fact is one of the most successful of the Roman poets, especially in this period, the beginning of the Roman Empire, in being able to show how that could work. The problem with Ovid was he had somewhat too loose a mouth, and he did a little bit too good a job with trying out different types of topics that one could discuss with poetry, and it is possible that as a result of that he inflamed the moral temperament of Emperor Augustus, and that might have been one of the things that got him exiled. All right, well anyway, his bio. Like Virgil, he was born up in the northern part of Italy. His birth date, 43 BC. Like Virgil, he grew up in the country, but he eventually traveled widely, including down to Rome, in order to receive a pretty wide education, both in Rome and in Greece, and presumably other places as well. Like Virgil, he did not pursue a political career. Instead, he devoted most of his time to poetry. The only exception to his devotion to politics, not being devoted to politics, is that he appears to have had a little bit of taste of the judicial life. He appears to have had some posts there. But aside from that, we simply don't have anything to indicate any kind of political interest. So like Virgil, Ovid published his poetry and eventually came into the sights of Octavian Emperor Augustus. Like Virgil, Ovid ended up being able to produce his own poetry under a sponsor. This time the sponsor was Messala. There he is. Messala, who is the correspondent to Maecenas, the one who you may remember in a previous video was the one who took care of Virgil and Virgil's friend Horace. So far everything is pretty much the same between Ovid and Virgil. But then something went grievously wrong. And at some point, we know that Augustus had, in 17 BC, in fact, had passed so-called sumptuary and moral laws. The sumptuary laws were designed to limit the amount of wealth one could have out in public, on public display. And the moral laws were pretty much that, an effort to legalize morality, and especially the distasteful practice of adultery. It worked that men were in a position to take vengeance on an adulterer if he was caught with the man's wife, whereas a woman who ends up finding her husband and an adulteress did not necessarily have any real ability to pursue any kind of legal or emotional reaction to that particular discovery. But what is evident is that a woman was definitely not supposed to be in an adulterous position. And Augustus passed very stringent legislation on that subject, essentially convicting anyone sentenced to adultery to exile or worse. Well, Augustus was a very successful emperor, but he had a terrible time with his family, and most notably his daughter Julia, who also, by the way, had a daughter of her own, also named Julia, who ended up following the same track. Both of them ended up getting around with men quite a bit, and both of them ended up getting sentenced to exile for adultery. In this case, we're referring to Augustus's daughter, Julia. Julia had the misfortune of being Augustus's only child. Since Augustus had no heir, a natural son, he imposed a lot of pressure on Julia to produce for him an heir, or to marry in the right family, which would then further along produce an heir. Julia herself had two sons who could potentially have been emperor, plus Julia had a couple of other liaisons in different places. We're going to discuss that more in a later video, that could have been helpful. None of it worked out, however, and eventually Julia, probably resentful at all that pressure from her father, ended up, as we say, getting to know men way too up close and personal. Maybe Ovid was one of those. We cannot be sure. It is also possible that Ovid's poem, the one called Ars Amatoria, the art of lovemaking, could very well have sparked fury from Augustus at all the immoral attitudes that are proposed and supported in that particular area of poetry, especially regarding adultery. Again, we cannot really be sure exactly what happened because Ovid does not tell us. But what is evident, and there's the appropriate darkness for right at the right time. Here we go. What is evident is that Ovid ended up in exile. And he went off to the Black Sea where it was cold and dark, just like it was a moment ago in this room. And when he was up there, he found nobody who could speak Latin, and all he could find was snow, which was pretty disappointing for somebody who grew up in a nice, warm Mediterranean climate. Ovid tried desperately to get himself recalled from exile by writing letters to his family, especially his third wife, but no luck. And as a result, Ovid ended up dying in exile. Now, although Ovid did not fare very well with his personal life due to the conclusion with exile for 10 years practically, Ovid was highly influential in the legacy of Roman literature. Most of Ovid's works, with the notable exception of Metamorphoses, were elegiacs. And as we talked about in a previous video briefly, but we'll bring up here, the elegiac meter is the one, just like with Catullus, that is written in a meter similar to dactylic hexameter, the one that Virgil uses, but then you have a stop halfway through the beats of every other line, every second, fourth, sixth, and eighth line, and so forth. So the dactylic line would sound like this. That's the 6 beats of the dactylic hexameter. Now the second line would go like this. And that's the elegiac line. And that, again, is every other line. Obviously, although I was only tapping out long, short, short, long, short, short, like that, that's a proper dactyl, a long syllable followed by 2 shorts. You could also have, of course, long, long. That's the spondaic line that replaces those two. So the elegiac meter was a very effective one, as we talked about before, for composing on many different types of topics. Originally, as its name suggests, it was used for funerary poetry, especially epitaphs on a stele back in ancient Greek times. But then once poets picked it up, it came to be used for many different topics, not necessarily love. If you took a look at Catullus' poetry earlier, you could see that although Catullus is involved with love quite a bit, and sometimes what goes on the bad side of love, he does really talk about other things too, and some of those find their way into elegiac meter as well. Okay, so Ovid is especially successful with the elegiac meter. And the first work he wrote, called Amores, is a takeoff on the Hellenistic trope of the poor poet in love. Poets are always in love with the wrong women. The woman is socially way above the man. The woman is unavailable, especially if the woman happens to be married. The poor poet doesn't have any real resources in order to be able to approach her properly or court her or take her out to dinner or anything. And the poet, therefore, is always on the losing end of things. Remember now that if a poet ever became happily married in love somehow, he would go out of business. He would no longer have a role as an elegiac poet. So Amores explains to a prospective poet in love, how do you write the poetry? To explain how you're in love, the door is blocking you, the woman won't have anything to do with you, and all that kind of stuff. The husband is there threatening you, and so forth. How do you deal with all that? So that's the Amores. That was the first work that Ovid published back in the 20s BC. Subsequent to that came the work that you read previously, the Heroides, the women's letters written to their men who have done them wrong. Subsequent to that, we get works about cosmetics and a couple of other works in there that you could see on your handout. And then we get the big one that may have caused Ovid all the trouble, Ars Amatoria. This is the one that explains in 2 books, the first 2, how a man is supposed to pursue a woman who is married, if the man wants her. The third book of those 3 is the one that really could have done it. That's to a woman, how she is supposed to pursue a man who is married. So apparently it's all right for the man to commit adultery, perhaps, but the woman definitely isn't supposed to. And to be advising a woman how to trick a man away from his own wife apparently was too much for Augustus to endure. The problem with that theory, though, is that it would have taken about 8 years for Augustus to decide that the work was so awful that it deserved exile. So we can't really be entirely sure whether that was the only motivation. It might have been one of several motivations that Augustus had to send Ovid to the Black Sea. All right, then comes a work called Fasti, which is a work about the calendar. Every one of the poems is related to a particular day of the calendar. and all the various rituals, festivals, traditions, mythology that's associated with those days. Because it was interrupted by his exile, the Fasti was only completed from January to June, regrettably. That's all we have, and probably all that was actually written. But it's still a marvelous mythological geographic work that we have related to the calendar. Well, now, of course, the big work, Metamorphoses. 15 books. It's quite a bit, but I promise you it's fun reading. 15 books of all different kinds of mythology from all across the world brought together into this one work. What Ovid does is to tell the creation story from the very beginning of creation. It's actually very similar to a Greek work by an author, Hesiod, called Theogony, the birth of the universe. Ovid, in like manner, starts off his work with creation, and then quickly gets into the theme of the transformation of various beings. Usually it's a human who has either suffered something wrong or done something wrong, and the transformation into a plant or a rock or a tree or a bird or animal or whatever else it might be is usually selected in order to prescribe appropriate punishment on the wrongdoer, or to alleviate suffering for the one who is in great distress. So in terms of chronology, the work runs from the early days of creation all the way up to current day, and takes the reader through a whole lot of ups and downs, with the gods intervening with humans, with, again, the various transformations. We start off mainly with gods, like in the flood, for instance, but then we gradually get into the way that humans interact with each other, and we see a lot of mistakes being made, incestuous behavior, for instance, or various forms of immorality, boasting, or bragging, not being properly worshipful of the gods, and so forth. All different kinds of misbehavior that are carried out, and which appropriately are dispatched. It's almost like we're trying to try out different ways of humans to behave as a kind of dress rehearsal, so that we can eventually shake out all the flaws and get to the proper way people are supposed to be behaving, which naturally is during the Roman Empire. So that's Metamorphoses, and we will, of course, discuss that in a lot more detail, especially as you go do your special projects related to character presentations from Metamorphoses. So Ovid ended up going out into exile almost immediately after the completion of this work, and when he was out in exile, he wrote some more poems having to do with his distraught feelings about being in exile. He wrote Tristia, the Sadnesses, and he also wrote the Epistulae ex Ponto, Letters from the Black Sea, trying to get himself reinstated unsuccessfully, and it was, of course, in exile that Ovid passed away. We have a couple of other works mentioned. There's one called Ibis, which is some type of invective poetry, but we are not sure that is actually his. And conversely, there is a tragedy that we know he wrote called Medea, presumably based after the one of Euripides, and maybe in some way connected with the one of our next author, Seneca, but we can't be sure. And unfortunately, that one got lost. So the works that you have listed in the handout, the elegiac works and the Metamorphoses, are the ones that we have surviving. As we say, it's kind of a pity that Ovid suffered this awful fate of exile, because in reality, Ovid was really a splendid, outstanding poet. Probably what stands out most notably about him, especially in contrast with the very staid, serious, solid Virgil, is that Ovid saw lots of imperfections in society and had no compunction at all about poking fun at every one of them. When you see especially the characters in Metamorphoses, many of them are downright silly. They're caught in embarrassing predicaments. There's especially Juno, when she punishes the slave girl named Galanthus by turning her into a weasel, because she bursts out laughing when Juno discovers that Jupiter has had another affair. And so a weasel, of course, is a laughing animal. The various characters can be silly. Sometimes the characters are quite tragic in their overtones, like Niobe, you'll see her. Sometimes they're very pathetic, sometimes sentimental, sometimes ennobling, like Baucis and Philemon when they welcome in Zeus and Hermes, or I should say Jupiter and Mercury, into their house for the best that they could serve for dinner to strangers. and so forth. This is, of course, the virtue of hospitality, and many other things. But all of it, of course, you have to remember, has to do with the moral virtues that ultimately triumph over moral decay eventually, as we get into the gradual founding of the Republic, I should say first the kingship, starting around book 12, moving on into the Republic rather rapidly, and then finally getting to the Empire with Caesar's death and the accession of Augustus to the Principate. So all of that comes across clearly, and again, even though you're going to be reading a form of Greek mythology when you're reading Metamorphoses, in the back of your mind, you should always try to consider the Roman message. How does this reflect Romanitas, as defined for you in your syllabus? What is it about this work, again, just like we talked about with Virgil in the midterm, what about this work of Metamorphoses makes it specifically Roman, as opposed to simply a whole bunch of random Greek or other myths all put together in a kind of Roman-like form, written in Latin? It really does seem to me there's quite a bit more to that, and as you do your character presentations and your point of view on Ovid later assignments, you should give serious thought to what type of Roman sensibility underpins the presentation of all these myths in this particular way. There's obviously the chronology, but you should be able to recognize that there's quite a bit more than that. Okay, so there's Ovid, a rather unhappy poet in life eventually, but a truly marvelously successful poet for his legacy. In our next videos, we will, of course, continue on with our Roman history, now coming into the Empire. And again, also, there are later videos coming in which we'll discuss the special assignments on the character presentations and the trial point of view of Ovid coming up in later weeks. Okay, we will see you next video on Roman history.